The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany coffin as Charles stood motionless in the crowded church. His weathered hands trembled slightly as they clutched a delicate silk scarf, its lavender hue catching the filtered light from the stained glass windows. The fabric still carried traces of Margaret's favorite perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and vanilla that had been her signature for 47 years of marriage. Charles remembered the day he first noticed that scent. He was a young accountant, fresh out of college, rushing through the revolving doors of the First National Bank building in downtown Chicago. Margaret had been stepping out just as he was entering, and their collision sent her papers flying across the marble floor. As they both knelt to gather the scattered documents, that distinctive fragrance enveloped him, mixing with her embarrassed laughter. She worked on the 7th floor as a secretary for the investment division, while he occupied a small cubicle on the 3rd floor. For weeks after their encounter, Charles found excuses to ride the elevator past his floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes. His colleagues teased him about his sudden interest in delivering documents personally to other departments. But Charles didn't care. He was thoroughly smitten. Their first date happened 3 months after the revolving door incident. Charles had finally gathered enough courage to wait by her desk at closing time, clutching a single red rose he'd purchased from a street vendor. Margaret later confessed she'd been hoping he would ask her out, having noticed his frequent accidental appearances on her floor. They went to a small Italian restaurant, where the checkered tablecloths were slightly stained and the breadsticks were unlimited. Charles was so nervous he knocked over his water glass twice, but Margaret just smiled and helped him clean up each time. The courtship lasted exactly 1 year. Charles proposed on a snowy December evening in Grant Park, getting down on one knee despite the slush soaking through his trousers. Margaret's yes was barely audible over the wind, but her tears of joy spoke volumes. They married the following spring in a modest ceremony attended by family and close friends. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her petite frame, and carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Their early years together were marked by the typical struggles of a young couple building a life. They rented a small apartment above a bakery, where the sweet smell of fresh bread woke them each morning. Charles worked long hours to earn promotions, while Margaret took evening classes to become a teacher. They saved every penny, dreaming of owning a house with a white picket fence and enough bedrooms for the large family they planned to have. The house came first, a modest 2-story colonial in the suburbs, with a leaky roof and outdated plumbing. They spent weekends painting walls, refinishing floors, and planting a vegetable garden in the backyard. Margaret had a natural green thumb, coaxing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs from the soil with patient care. Charles built raised beds and a small greenhouse, delighting in how her face lit up when the first seedlings sprouted. Children, however, proved more elusive than homeownership. After 2 years of trying, they consulted specialists who delivered devastating news about Margaret's inability to conceive. The diagnosis hit them like a physical blow, shattering dreams of little feet running through their carefully prepared home. They grieved privately and together, holding each other through tear-filled nights and silent dinners. Adoption became their path to parenthood. The process was lengthy and emotionally draining, filled with home visits, interviews, and endless paperwork. But when the call finally came about a 3-month-old girl in need of a family, their hearts knew instantly she was meant to be theirs. They named her Emily Rose, after both their mothers, and she filled their home with a joy they'd feared might never come. Emily grew from a chubby-cheeked baby into a precocious toddler who inherited her adoptive mother's love of books and her father's analytical mind. Margaret left her teaching position to stay home, transforming their spare bedroom into a magical nursery decorated with hand-painted murals of fairy tale scenes. Charles would find them there each evening, Margaret reading stories while Emily traced the illustrated characters with tiny fingers. 2 years later, they received another call. A baby boy, just 6 weeks old, needed placement. Without hesitation, they welcomed Thomas James into their family. Where Emily was thoughtful and quiet, Tommy was exuberant and physical, climbing before he could properly walk and turning every surface into a drum. The house that once seemed too large now burst with life, toys scattered across floors and children's artwork covering the refrigerator. Margaret returned to teaching when both children entered school, taking a position at the same elementary school they attended. She became known for her innovative lessons and genuine care for struggling students. Parents requested her class specifically, knowing she would nurture their children's potential with the same devotion she showed her own family. Charles, now a senior manager at the bank, adjusted his schedule to handle morning routines so Margaret could prepare her classroom. Weekends were sacred family time. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like animals and afternoons at the park or museum. Sundays brought church, followed by large family dinners, where Margaret's pot roast became legendary among their extended family. She taught Emily her secret recipe for apple pie, while Charles and Tommy built model airplanes in the garage, the smell of glue and paint mixing with cinnamon and nutmeg. The scarf Charles now held had been a Christmas gift from the children when Emily was 15 and Tommy 13. They'd saved their allowances for months to buy the designer accessory, knowing their mother admired it during a shopping trip. Margaret cried when she opened the box, not because of the scarf's elegance but because her children had noticed such a small detail of her wants. She wore it constantly after that, to parent-teacher conferences, church services, and evening walks with Charles. Years flowed like water through their fingers. Emily left for college, pursuing a degree in social work, inspired by her own adoption story. Tommy followed 2 years later, his passion for engineering leading him to a prestigious technical school. The house felt enormous again, but Margaret filled the space with new pursuits. She started a book club, volunteered at the local food bank, and convinced Charles to take ballroom dancing lessons. Those dancing lessons became a highlight of their empty nest years. Every Thursday evening, they'd dress up and head to the community center, where a patient instructor guided them through foxtrots and waltzes. Charles had 2 left feet, but Margaret never complained when he stepped on her toes. She'd just laugh and pull him closer, whispering that she didn't marry him for his dancing skills. Other couples often paused to watch them, not because of technical perfection but because their love radiated with every movement. Retirement arrived for both within the same year. Charles left the bank with a gold watch and pension, while Margaret received a touching farewell from colleagues and students spanning 3 decades. They celebrated with a Mediterranean cruise they'd always dreamed about, holding hands while watching sunsets over the Aegean Sea. Margaret wore her lavender scarf every evening at dinner, joking that it made her feel like a movie star. The grandchildren came in quick succession once Emily and Tommy married. First was Margaret's namesake, little Maggie, born to Emily and her husband Robert. Then came twin boys, Jack and Oliver, keeping Tommy and his wife Sarah on their toes. Finally, another girl, Grace, completed Emily's family. The house once again filled with chaos during holiday gatherings. Margaret orchestrating elaborate meals while Charles played on the floor with the grandchildren. She started showing symptoms during Grace's 2nd birthday party. Just small things at first, forgetting where she put the cake server, calling Jack by Tommy's name, needing to sit down more frequently. Charles noticed, but said nothing, attributing it to the natural aging process. But when she got lost driving home from the grocery store she'd shopped at for 30 years, they both knew something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis came after months of tests and specialists. Early onset Alzheimer's, the doctor said with practiced sympathy. The words hung in the sterile office air like a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Margaret gripped Charles's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she didn't cry. Not until they reached the parking lot, where she collapsed against the car and sobbed while Charles held her, his own tears falling into her graying hair. They told the children together, gathered around the dining room table, where so many happy memories had been made. Emily immediately began researching treatment options while Tommy dealt with his grief by creating detailed care plans and home modifications. The grandchildren were told in age-appropriate ways, though little Maggie seemed to understand instinctively that something had shifted in her grandmother's world. Margaret faced the disease with the same grace she'd brought to every challenge. She started a journal, writing letters to each grandchild for future milestones she might miss. She recorded videos of herself reading favorite bedtime stories and sharing family histories. She taught Emily all her recipes, standing patiently beside her daughter as they cooked together, muscle memory guiding her hands when words began to fail. The progression was cruelly swift. Within a year, she struggled with names and faces. Charles labeled every photograph in the house, created memory books, and played their wedding song every morning. On good days, she'd smile and dance with him in the kitchen. On bad days, she'd look at him with confused eyes and ask when her husband was coming home. Those days broke Charles in ways he didn't know were possible. He became her constant companion and caregiver, refusing suggestions of professional help until it became absolutely necessary. He learned to redirect her confusion with gentle lies that brought comfort instead of correction. When she insisted on setting a place at dinner for her long-deceased mother, he simply added the extra plate. When she wanted to go home while sitting in their living room, he'd drive her around the block until she dozed off, then carry her inside. The children visited as often as possible, bringing the grandchildren to spark moments of recognition. Sometimes Margaret would light up at their presence, calling them by name and asking about school. Other times she'd smile politely at the strangers in her living room, offering them cookies she no longer remembered how to bake. The grandchildren adapted with the resilience of youth, learning to introduce themselves each visit and treasure the fleeting moments of connection. Charles documented everything in a journal of his own, though his entries were more practical than emotional. Medication schedules, doctor appointments, good days versus bad days. He couldn't bring himself to write about watching the woman he loved disappear piece by piece, like a photograph fading in reverse. Instead, he focused on tasks he could control, creating routines that brought Margaret comfort even when she couldn't articulate her needs. Music became their primary form of communication as words grew increasingly elusive. Charles would play their collection of vinyl records, watching Margaret's face for signs of recognition. Big band music from their dating years often prompted her to sway in her chair. The Beatles reminded her of Emily's teenage years when she'd play Hey Jude endlessly. Classical pieces from Tommy's piano recitals sometimes brought tears she couldn't explain, but felt deeply. The day she stopped recognizing him entirely was a Tuesday. Charles brought her morning tea as usual, but when he leaned in for their customary good morning kiss, she recoiled. "I'm married," she said firmly, clutching her wedding ring. "My husband wouldn't like you being here." No amount of photo albums or gentle reminders could convince her otherwise. From that day forward, Charles introduced himself as a friend named Charlie, who came to help around the house. He hired a part-time aide named Rosa, a kind woman with infinite patience who had cared for her own mother through similar decline. Rosa taught Charles tricks for managing Margaret's increasing anxiety and showed him how to create a soothing environment. Together, they established new routines that provided structure without demanding memory. Margaret seemed to accept Rosa more easily than family, perhaps because there were no expectations attached to their relationship. The house transformed to accommodate Margaret's changing needs. Charles removed mirrors that caused her distress when she didn't recognize her reflection. He installed locks on cabinets containing potentially dangerous items and placed signs on doors to help her navigate. The guest bedroom became his, as Margaret grew agitated sharing a bed with a stranger. Though he often found her curled up on his side in the morning, unconsciously seeking familiar comfort. Emily took a leave of absence from work to help more as Margaret's condition deteriorated. She and Charles developed a tag-team approach, ensuring someone was always present while allowing each other breaks. Emily would take her mother for drives through old neighborhoods, narrating stories of their shared past that Margaret received like fiction. Sometimes a detail would spark recognition, the color of a house, the smell of a bakery, and Margaret would add her own memories before the moment passed. Tommy channeled his grief into practical solutions, researching every clinical trial and experimental treatment. He flew in specialists for second opinions and investigated alternative therapies. When conventional medicine offered no miracles, he built adaptive devices to help his mother maintain independence longer. A simplified telephone with photo buttons for family members, color-coded drawers for clothing, a digital frame that cycled through family photos with names and relationships listed. The grandchildren found their own ways to connect. Maggie would sit quietly beside her grandmother, coloring while Margaret watched. The twins brought their soccer ball, content to kick it back and forth while she clapped. Grace, still young enough to live entirely in the present moment, simply climbed into Margaret's lap for stories, unconcerned when they made no sense or ended mid-sentence. Their innocent acceptance provided comfort Margaret couldn't find with adults who remembered who she used to be. Winter arrived with unusual severity that year. Charles worried constantly about Margaret's tendency to wander, installing additional locks and alarm systems. But one January evening while he was in the basement switching laundry, she somehow slipped outside. By the time the door alarm sounded, she'd made it to the end of the driveway in only her nightgown and slippers, convinced she was late for teaching school. He found her standing in the snow, shivering violently but smiling. "The children are waiting," she explained through chattering teeth. "I can't find my lesson plans." Charles wrapped his coat around her and guided her inside, his heart breaking at her distress over imaginary students. She developed pneumonia from the exposure, spending 2 weeks in the hospital where the unfamiliar environment accelerated her confusion. The illness marked a turning point. Margaret returned home weakened and requiring round-the-clock care. Charles hired additional help but refused to consider memory care facilities, determined to keep his promise that she'd always be home. He converted the dining room into a bedroom to avoid stairs and spent his days in a chair beside her bed, reading aloud from books she'd once loved even when she showed no signs of comprehension. Spring arrived, but Margaret didn't notice. She spent most days sleeping, waking only for meals she rarely finished, and medications that no longer seemed to help. The moments of lucidity grew so rare that when they occurred, Charles would call the children immediately, everyone dropping everything for a chance at one more real conversation. But usually by the time they arrived, she'd slipped back into the fog, leaving them gathered around her bed, making small talk with each other. The scarf remained a constant presence, carefully folded on her dresser where Charles could see it from his chair. Sometimes he'd drape it around her shoulders, hoping the familiar texture might provide comfort. Other times he'd hold it himself, breathing in the fading scent that still triggered 1,000 memories. Rosa noticed his attachment and made sure the scarf was always within reach, understanding its significance without needing explanation. One morning in late May, something shifted. Margaret woke with unusual clarity, asking for Charles by name for the first time in months. He rushed to her side, taking her frail hand as she smiled with recognition that reached her eyes. "I know you," she whispered, touching his face with trembling fingers. "You're my Charlie. You've been here all along, haven't you?" They spent that day in a bubble of grace, Margaret drifting in and out but always knowing him when she woke. She asked about the children and grandchildren, nodding as he updated her on their lives. She requested her favorite songs and hummed along weakly. As evening approached, she asked him to bring the lavender scarf, holding it against her cheek with a contented sigh. "Remember when the kids gave this to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles confirmed he remembered, though he doubted she truly recalled the details. But then she surprised him, adding, "Emily saved for months. Tommy gave up baseball cards to contribute. They wanted me to have something beautiful." Her eyes filled with tears that seemed to carry the weight of everything she'd lost and found again in this moment. The children arrived as word spread about her lucidity, bringing the grandchildren for what everyone silently acknowledged might be a final goodbye. Margaret greeted each by name, offering specific messages that seemed pulled from a deeper place than memory. To Emily, "Take care of your father. He pretends to be strong." To Tommy, "Stop trying to fix everything. Some things are meant to break." To each grandchild, a whispered blessing and touch of her hand. As night fell, the clarity began to fade again, but a sense of peace remained. Margaret asked Charles to lie beside her, something she hadn't allowed in months. He carefully positioned himself on the narrow hospital bed, cradling her against his chest like they used to sleep for 47 years. She pressed the scarf between them, its silk cool against their intertwined hands. "I'm tired, Charlie," she murmured against his shoulder. "So very tired." "Then rest, my love," he whispered back, kissing her forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up." She slept through the night without stirring, her breathing growing shallower as dawn approached. Charles never moved, holding her as life slowly ebbed from the body that had housed such a magnificent spirit. When the sun finally broke through the bedroom curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny angels, Margaret took one last breath that sounded almost like contentment, then was still. Charles knew without checking for a pulse. The absence of her breathing created a vacuum in the room, a silence so profound it seemed to stop time itself. He continued to hold her, unable to let go of the physical form that had been his anchor for nearly half a century. The scarf remained clutched between them, now a bridge between the living and the dead. Emily found them an hour later when she arrived for her morning shift. She understood immediately, seeing the peace on her mother's face and the devastation on her father's. She quietly called Tommy and the hospice nurse, then sat on the bed's edge, adding her hand to theirs, still wrapped around the scarf. When Tommy arrived, he joined them, the family forming a circle of grief and gratitude around the woman who had been their center. The funeral director had to gently convince Charles to let them take Margaret's body. He insisted on keeping the scarf, clutching it like a talisman as strangers wheeled away the shell of his beloved. The children stayed with him as he sat in the empty bedroom, staring at the hospital bed that would be removed tomorrow, but today stood as a monument to love's endurance through the valley of shadows. Planning the funeral became a way to channel grief into action. Margaret had left detailed instructions years earlier, when she could still think clearly, requesting a simple service focused on celebrating life rather than mourning death. She wanted her favorite hymns sung badly and with enthusiasm. She wanted people to laugh at funny stories and cry from joy as much as sorrow. Most importantly, she wanted everyone to eat too much at the reception, insisting grief required good food. Charles moved through the preparations in a daze, making decisions when asked but struggling to engage with details that seemed simultaneously crucial and meaningless. What flowers for the casket? What photographs for the memorial board? What dress for her burial? Emily and Tommy handled most arrangements, understanding their father needed to simply survive each hour until the service. The church filled beyond capacity on the day of the funeral. Former students, now adults with children of their own, came to honor the teacher who had changed their lives. Colleagues from both Charles's bank and Margaret's school sat shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, book club members, and dancing partners. The grandchildren served as honorary pallbearers, their young faces solemn with the weight of the duty. Charles sat in the front pew, the lavender scarf carefully folded in his lap. He'd considered placing it in the casket, but couldn't bear the thought of burying this last tangible connection. Throughout the service, his fingers traced its edges. Each thread, a memory of the woman who'd worn it with such grace. The familiar scent of jasmine and vanilla seemed stronger in the church, as if Margaret's spirit had infused the very air. Reverend Patterson, who'd known Margaret for 30 years, delivered a eulogy that balanced humor with heartbreak. He told the story of her volunteering to direct the Christmas pageant, despite having no theatrical experience, resulting in shepherds who wandered off stage and an angel who forgot to announce anything. But somehow, he noted, it became the most memorable pageant in church history, because Margaret's joy in the chaos was contagious. Emily spoke next, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. She talked about being chosen by Margaret and Charles, how adoption had made her not just their daughter but their conscious choice every single day. She shared how her mother had handled the Alzheimer's diagnosis with the same grace she'd faced infertility, transforming personal tragedy into lessons about resilience for everyone around her. Tommy's tribute focused on his mother's hands, how they'd bandaged, scraped knees, kneaded bread dough, graded papers with encouraging comments, and held his own children with infinite gentleness. Even when her mind forgot their names, he said, her hands remembered how to comfort. He choked up, describing their last lucid conversation, when she'd told him to stop trying to fix everything, finally understanding she meant him to accept peace in the breaking. Former students lined up to share brief memories. A successful doctor credited Margaret with recognizing his dyslexia and fighting for proper support. A young mother recalled how Mrs. Henderson had noticed bruises and quietly ensured she got help at home. A businessman remembered being the poor kid who couldn't afford field trips until anonymous donations always seemed to appear. Story after story painted a portrait of a woman whose influence rippled far beyond her immediate family. The grandchildren sang "Amazing Grace," their young voices wavering but determined. Maggie played a simple piano accompaniment, while the twins and Grace stood bravely before the congregation. They'd practiced with their parents all week, wanting to honor Grandma Margaret perfectly. When Jack forgot the words to the second verse, Oliver quietly prompted him, their bond as twins bridging the gap. Not a dry eye remained when they finished. Charles stood to speak last, though he'd insisted he wouldn't be able to. But surrounded by evidence of Margaret's impact, he found strength in the community she'd built. He pulled the lavender scarf from his lap, holding it up for everyone to see, then told its story. The children saving money, Margaret's tears on Christmas morning, how she'd worn it to every special occasion afterward, how it still smelled like her, still carried her essence in its fibers. He talked about their collision at the revolving door. That first breath of jasmine and vanilla that had changed his life's trajectory. He shared their journey through young love, infertility, adoption, career building, child rearing, and growing old together. He spoke honestly about the Alzheimer's years, refusing to minimize their difficulty but emphasizing how Margaret's essential kindness never disappeared, even when everything else did. "She forgot my name," he said, his voice breaking. "But she never forgot how to love. Even on the worst days, when I was a stranger to her, she'd thank me for my kindness. She'd pat my hand and tell me I seemed like a good man, and I'd think, I'm only good because you made me so." This scarf still smells like her perfume. But more than that, it smells like hope and persistence, and the choice to love through every season. He sat down to thunderous applause that seemed inappropriate for a funeral, until Reverend Patterson reminded everyone this was what Margaret wanted, a celebration that honored life while acknowledging death. The congregation sang, "How Great Thou Art," with the enthusiasm Margaret had requested, voices cracking and off-key but filled with genuine emotion. As the final notes faded, Charles stood to follow the casket out, still clutching the scarf. The graveside service was smaller, limited to family and closest friends. The June sun beat down mercilessly as they gathered under the funeral home's green tent. Charles watched numbly as the casket was lowered, part of him wanting to stop the mechanical descent that would separate him from Margaret's physical form forever. Emily and Tommy flanked him, their presence the only thing keeping him upright. Each grandchild threw a rose onto the casket, saying private goodbyes. Grace, too young to fully understand permanence, asked if Grandma Margaret could see the pretty flowers from heaven. Charles knelt beside her, agreeing that surely she could, and that she was probably planning what to plant in heaven's garden. The innocent question somehow made the moment bearable, reducing cosmic loss to a child's simple faith. The reception fulfilled Margaret's wishes for abundant food and storytelling. The church ladies had outdone themselves with casseroles, salads, and enough desserts to stock a bakery. Charles found himself at the center of a constantly shifting group of mourners, each sharing their own Margaret story. He listened with half his attention, the other half focused on the scarf he couldn't stop touching, as if it were a rosary of remembrance. As afternoon faded to evening, the crowd gradually dispersed. Charles insisted on helping clean up, needing the mundane task of washing dishes and folding tables. Emily tried to convince him to go home and rest, but he couldn't face the empty house yet. Tommy understood better, working silently beside his father, letting shared labor substitute for impossible conversations. Finally, when the church hall was restored to order, Charles allowed his children to drive him home. The house felt different, as if Margaret's absence had changed its molecular structure. Her presence lingered in every corner. Reading glasses on the side table, medications lined up on the kitchen counter, her favorite mug in the dish drainer. But the animating spirit was gone, leaving only artifacts. The children stayed that first night, camping out in the living room like they had during thunderstorms as kids. Nobody slept well, but the shared insomnia felt appropriate. They looked through photo albums, telling stories the pictures triggered. Charles shared details he'd never mentioned before. Their first fight over wallpaper choices, the time Margaret accidentally dyed all his white shirts pink, how she'd practiced her wedding vows in the mirror because she was terrified of forgetting them. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Emily made breakfast while Tommy sorted through the sympathy cards that had already begun arriving. Charles sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd shared thousands of meals with Margaret, the scarf draped over her empty chair. He knew he'd have to learn to live without her physical presence. But for now, he allowed himself to pretend she'd just stepped out to the garden. Days blurred into weeks as Charles established new routines in a life suddenly singular instead of plural. Emily and Tommy took turns checking on him, bringing groceries and grandchildren in equal measure. He started attending a grief support group at church, finding unexpected comfort in others who understood the specific loneliness of losing a spouse to Alzheimer's. They called themselves widowed twice, once to the disease, again to death. The scarf became his constant companion. He kept it on his nightstand, carried it in his jacket pocket when he went out, held it while watching television in the evenings. Rosa, who'd stayed on to help him adjust, never commented on his attachment. She simply made sure the scarf was treated gently, hand-washing it when necessary, and returning it to him still warm from careful ironing. 3 months after the funeral, Charles decided to create a memory garden in the backyard. He planted Margaret's favorite flowers, roses, lavender, and jasmine, arranged around a small bench where he could sit and feel close to her. The grandchildren helped, their young hands patting soil around roots while he told them about their grandmother's gardening prowess. The scarf hung from his pocket as he worked, occasionally brushing against the plants as if blessing them. He discovered grief wasn't linear, but cyclical, hitting at unexpected moments with fresh intensity. The smell of pot roast could reduce him to tears. Finding one of her handwritten grocery lists in a cookbook felt like discovering treasure. He started writing letters to her, filling notebooks with daily updates she'd never read. It helped to maintain the dialogue that had sustained him for nearly 5 decades. The holidays approached with dread. Emily suggested they change traditions to make them bearable. But Charles insisted on maintaining Margaret's established patterns. He wanted the grandchildren to remember her through repeated rituals. The same cookies made from her recipes, the same ornaments on the tree, the same stories told after dinner. If it hurt him to preserve these traditions, that pain was preferable to letting her influence fade. On Christmas morning, he gave each grandchild something that had belonged to Margaret. Maggie received her journal, filled with letters for future milestones. The twins got her collection of baseball cards, accumulated during Tommy's childhood obsession. Grace, still young, got a music box that played Edelweiss, which Margaret had hummed during bedtime routines. Each gift came wrapped in tissue paper, scented with jasmine and vanilla, a detail only Charles noticed. Charles saved the scarf for Emily, explaining it should pass to her as the eldest daughter. But Emily gently refused, insisting it belonged with him for as long as he needed it. "When you're ready, Dad," she said, understanding the scarf represented more than silk and memories. It was Margaret's continued presence in tangible form, a transitional object no psychology textbook could adequately explain. Winter passed slowly, each day a small victory of survival. Charles learned to cook simple meals, though nothing tasted quite right without Margaret's seasoning. He continued attending church, sitting in their usual pew, leaving space where she would have been. He maintained the house and garden, knowing she'd want both preserved. Some days were harder than others, but he found purpose in honoring her legacy through continued living. Spring arrived with crocuses pushing through the last snow, planted bulbs Margaret had ordered before her final decline. Charles knelt in the garden, weeping at this gift from beyond. This proof that beauty persists past its planter. He pressed the scarf to his face, inhaling deeply, and for a moment felt her presence so strongly he turned, expecting to see her standing there with dirty gloves and a satisfied smile. On their wedding anniversary, he visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. He brought the scarf and a thermos of tea, sitting on the grass to share the morning with her. He talked about the grandchildren's growth, Emily's promotion at work, Tommy's new house. He told her about the support group, the garden, his terrible attempts at her pot roast recipe. Mostly, he told her he missed her with an intensity that hadn't diminished but had become incorporated into his daily existence. A year after her death, the family gathered for a memorial service. This time, the tears were gentler, mixed with laughter, as they shared newer memories of Margaret's lasting influence. Maggie read a poem she'd written, Tommy played a song on his guitar, and the younger children sang again with stronger voices. Charles spoke about learning to carry grief and gratitude simultaneously, how Margaret had taught him this final lesson in grace. He still carries the scarf, though the perfume has faded to barely a whisper. Sometimes strangers ask about it. Puzzled by an elderly man clutching lavender silk, he simply smiles and says it belonged to his wife, letting them assume whatever story makes sense to them. The truth. That love transcends death. That memory lives in objects. That 47 years of marriage creates bonds that outlast breathing, is too large for casual explanation. In quiet moments, Charles wraps the scarf around his shoulders and closes his eyes. He sees Margaret in their kitchen, dancing badly to big band music. He sees her in the garden, dirt under her nails and joy on her face. He sees her holding their babies, teaching eager students, growing old beside him with grace and humor. The scarf may have lost her scent, but it still carries the weight of a life fully lived and deeply loved. Tomorrow he'll wake again in their bed, alone but not abandoned. He'll make tea for one but set out 2 cups from habit and hope. He'll tend the garden she planned and host the grandchildren she adored. He'll carry the scarf in his pocket, a silk reminder that love doesn't end with death, but transforms, becoming memory, becoming legacy, becoming the strength to continue until reunion. And someday, when his own breathing stills, perhaps someone will find him clutching lavender silk, still scented with the faintest trace of jasmine and vanilla, still connecting him to Margaret, still proving love endures.